This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Hey guys, today I'm interviewing my cat about his perfect bistro food. Percy, you seem to be a big Perfect Bistro fan. Care to comment? Totally. What do you like about it? You love the high-quality ingredients? And the delicious flavors, of course. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Listen to Percy, guys. Visit perfectbistro.com to try it for your cat.
¿Escuchan eso? Es el delicioso encuentro entre un Extra Crispy McCrispy Strip y la cremosa salsa César. Si así suena, solo imagínate cómo sabe. Salsa César, en McDonald's por tiempo limitado. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and with me once again is the fantastic Nathaniel Marshell. Hello, Nathaniel.
Hello, good to be back.
For those of you who don't remember, Nathaniel was with us back a little while ago. We did an episode on Patton, which was fabulous, one of our most downloaded episodes. So I recommend you check that out. And Nathaniel, for those who don't know, can you kind of give everyone a background on your education there?
So I am a military history PhD candidate at the University of North Texas. My research focuses on prisoners of war during the Second World War. Specifically, I'm looking at naval prisoners of war. So that kind of leads into our topic today as we talk about Dönitz.
Yeah, we're talking about Admiral Dönitz, who we were talking before he came on, probably had the least wanted job promotion in history.
That's putting it lightly.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I likened it to the Titanic going down after the iceberg, and the captain says, "All right, she's your ship now."
Well, that's putting it real nicely. I'm not sure Dönitz's promotion is necessarily becoming captain of the Titanic after it hits the iceberg as much as it is as, you know, the stern is already sinking and it's just the bow poking out of the water.
Well, I was trying to use a naval reference there. But yeah, we're going to talk about Admiral Dönitz, who was born in 1891, and he served in both world wars to become one of Germany's most influential naval commanders. What do we know about his early life?
So his early life is a little bit obscure. There's not too much written about it in English. If you can read German, he's written a pretty decent memoir of his early life, but for our sake, we'll try to keep it brief. The important things to remember is that he's born near Granau, near Berlin, to Anna Bayer and Emil Dönitz. They're middle class. They provide their son a pretty decent life. In 1910, Dönitz enters the Muvik Naval Academy near Flensburg. Basically as a midshipman, he receives his college education there, and he gets commissioned to the Imperial German Navy in 1913. When the First World War broke out, he was on the German cruiser Breslau in the Mediterranean. Very shortly after the outbreak of war in August 1914, the German Empire actually sells the Breslau to the Ottomans. And as part of this agreement, the crew of the Breslau are allowed to stay on the Breslau as it becomes an Ottoman ship. But they wear Ottoman uniforms and they fly an Ottoman flag and are de facto members of the Ottoman Navy. So here's Dönitz as basically an Ottoman sailor on the Breslau, which gets renamed, of course. And he serves there for 2 years in the Black Sea against the Russian forces there. And eventually Dönitz gets fed up. He's like, you know, I don't really like what's going on now. I'd like to really get my feet wet. Pardon the pun there. I'd like to get my feet wet with the submarine service. So in 1916, he requests this transfer. It goes through October of that year. He finishes submarine school in January 1917, and thereafter he's assigned as the first watch officer on the U-39. Very shortly after that, he's actually given command of his own ship, the UC-25, in February 1918. And a little bit after that, in July 1918, he gets command of another submarine, the UB-68, and that's his final command of the war, as we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, during World War I, he served aboard submarines, as you mentioned, is captured by the British near the end of the war. Submarines are a new technology, but they're also extremely dangerous. What was life like on these early submarines?
Well, there's definitely more pleasant ways to spend the First World War, and for that matter, the Second World War. So U-boats during both World Wars were really tiny vessels. They're smelly, they're cramped, they're these leaky, cold, bitterly cold in the winter, brutally hot in the summer sort of things, where you and between 30 and 35 of your best mates in the case of a World War I submarine, or as many as 50 in the case of a World War II submarine, work, eat, sleep in very close quarters. If you're an enlisted man on the submarine, you're not having a bunk to yourself, you're hot bunking, right? So your bunkmate would get up, go on watch as you're coming off, you'd sleep in his bed, and then vice versa. Just a really unpleasant experience. Your food's going rotten pretty quickly. For most of your patrol, you're living off canned foods, which is fine for a while, but I imagine it gets really old really quick. And when you're eating things like canned sausages, canned bread, canned sauerkraut, as you live next to between 30 and 50 of your closest friends, you can imagine how disgusting the inside of these submarines really were. Most of the time, they're under the surface for a very short amount of time. They usually sail on the surface looking for vessels, and usually they attack. Especially during World War I and the early stage of World War II, they attack on the surface at night. These vessels should be thought of as submersible vessels, not underwater. They are vessels that can go underwater.
I think that's a big misconception because you think of submarines now, and they go underwater for days or weeks at a time. These aren't doing that. They're cruising on the water for the majority of the time.
So they have limited battery capacity. They have to run on electric motors, but this is, 1918 and then through to the Second World War. Battery technology just isn't there. They have a very, very limited submersible time. They're only able to stay under the water for a certain amount of time. And at the same time, they're prone to all sorts of mechanical hazards, just left, right, and center. And this is what really dooms Dönitz in the First World War. Or rather, it probably actually saves his life. Dönitz's final action as a sailor during the First World War happens on the 3rd of October, 1918. He gets lined up to attack a convoy near Malta. So he runs into this convoy submerged, and he has a mechanical malfunction that flips his entire ship upside down underneath the water, and they start to careen towards the bottom. So Dönitz and his crew, to their credit, they're able to identify, hey, we have to do something right now or we're all dead. And he forces his submarine to the surface. It corrects this rotation that's happening. But the problem is when Dönitz, he opens the conning tower as the commander of the ship, goes out to take a look around. He goes, oh, I'm right smack dab in the middle of this convoy in broad daylight, and the escorts are bearing down on me. So obviously what you would want to submerge in that sort of situation, but they've just used all of their compressed air to try to correct the situation. So Dönitz is left with kind of no other option than to order his crew to abandon the ship. So obviously they abandon the ship. The submarine sinks. He's captured by the Royal Navy and taken to Malta. He stays, as a prisoner of war on Malta until the end of the war. He's taken to England thereafter, and he stays there until summer 1919. And he returns to Germany that July.
Yeah, his wartime experiences convinced him that submarines could be Germany's most effective naval weapon. He also gets married during World War I to Ingeborg Weber. Did they have any children? And if so, what happened to his children?
In May 1916, Dönitz marries a nurse named Ingeborg Weber. This is kind of funny. She is the daughter of a German general named Erich Weber, which, of course, this doesn't really allow Dönitz to do anything. He doesn't capitalize on these connections to further his career, at least as far as I can tell. But they actually do have 3 children. Their first child, Ursula, was born in April 1916. Their son, Klaus, was born in May 1920. And their youngest son, Peter, was born in March 1922. So Klaus and Peter, they both follow in their father's footsteps, and they join the German Navy. Tragically, both are killed during the war. So Peter died on the 19th of May, 1943, along with the rest of the crew of the submarine U-954. It's kind of ironic that Peter is directly under his father's command and dies directly under his father's command during the war. U-954 goes down southeast of Greenland. It's sank by the Royal Navy to the loss of all hands. After Peter's death, Hitler recognizes, hey, I have to do something about this. And he issues a policy stating that if a senior military officer like Dönitz, for example, had lost a son in combat and had other sons that were in the military, then those other sons would be pulled from service and returned to civilian life, right? You kind of don't want your senior military leaders to lose their entire bloodline through military action.
It's like the Saving Private Ryan thing.
It's the same thing. You don't want to wipe out a bloodline, and you don't want that thought weighing on your senior military leaders' heads as they're trying to make admittedly hard calls.
Yeah.
So Klaus is withdrawn from combat service, and he's starting to study to be like a surgeon in the German Navy. Well, on his birthday in 1944, on May 13th, Klaus manages to convince some of his buddies to let him come with them on a raid. They're going on our E-boat raid, which is a speedboat, basically, with a bunch of torpedoes on it. And they're going to raid southern England, and Klaus wants to go along, right? He misses this thrill of naval combat, and they let him come along. Unfortunately, S-141, the ship that they're on, gets intercepted and sank by a French destroyer, and Klaus dies.
Yeah, it's a tragic story because like his friends knew the law and they weren't supposed to let him aboard, and they did anyways.
Yeah, so it's a real tragedy, but his daughter Ursula, she survives the war and she lives until like the 90s and has children.
Yeah, it's surprising how many of these generals. I know Manstein lost a son on the Eastern Front. A lot of these guys had similar things where you lost someone close to you on, and Stalin even lost a son in World War II.
Yes.
Well, Dönitz, kind of in between wars, he develops and refines the famous Wolfpack tactic, in which multiple U-boats coordinated attacks against Allied convoys. How does this work?
So the whole Wolfpack or Rudeltaktik, it comes about as a countermeasure to beat escorted convoys, right? So escorted convoys would be really difficult for a lone submarine to penetrate. What using a Wolfpack tactic does is it congregates multiple submarines in one location to attack a convoy simultaneously, right? So when you attack with multiple submarines at one time, it diverts that escort's attention and it increases the survivability of each U-boat in the Wolfpack. It doesn't guarantee that, an escort's not going to bear down on a particular U-boat, but if you have 6, 7, 12 U-boats in an area all attacking at the same time, 4 or 5 escorts are going to be dashing around the seas trying to find something.
Are they picking one ship or are they just attacking the whole convoy?
Attacking the whole convoy in general. So usually what happens, and this is a problem that plagues submariners during both World Wars, is finding targets, right? So if you have all your submarines congregated together in one square, you're really limiting your vision. So what Dönitz's Wolfpack tactics entail is fanning out all of the submarines that he was going to have at sea at any given time along a broad line where he expects there to be convoy travel. These submarines sail around on patrols, and then they sight vessels, right? Or sights a convoy, rather. That submarine will report back to Dönitz saying, hey, I've got a convoy, estimate X number of ships, X number of escorts at C square 1, 2, 3, 4. Dönitz would then look at that, he would pull up his charts, see all the submarines that were in the area, and he would order them to meet at a pre-arranged location. As those submarines are all traveling towards their congregation point, the original reporting submarine will tail behind the convoy, reporting just out of sight if there's any deviations to their course, anything like that. Once enough U-boats had made it to that congregation area at any given time, the signal to attack would be given, and those submarines would attack the convoy all at once. The smallest Wolfpack during the Second World War was 2 submarines, which is hardly a Wolfpack, but the largest was 34. 34 submarines attacking a convoy at one time. The majority of these Wolfpacks, though, are anywhere from 10 to 12 or so. But mind you, these convoys are escorted by only a handful of escort vessels.
Yeah, Dönitz became commander of the German U-boat arm, the BDU, in 1939, and directed submarine operations throughout much of the war. So how much credit should Dönitz receive for the earlier success of the German U-boat campaign?
So yeah, in October 1939, Dönitz, he gets promoted to Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, right, which is like the officer commanding U-boats. He is the chief of the German submarine service. Anytime anything related to submarines is discussed, it goes through Dönitz. Before that, however, he was placed in charge of building the German submarine service from the ground up. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that Germany was not allowed to have any submarines. Well, obviously, after Hitler takes command, that starts not necessarily being true anymore. So in 1935, Admiral Raeder taps Dönitz to build this new German submarine service. And to his credit, it seems that Dönitz was the right man for the job. He hits the ground running. He starts training the core of his new U-Boot-Waffe, right? His new U-boat arm. He sets about devising tactics. He refines these tactics that he had, floating around in his mind during the First World War. He trains his men really hard between 35 and 39. And in doing so, he fosters a confidence within the German submarine force, both in the equipment, the German submarines themselves are capable of achieving these things, but also in the leadership. These German submariners, they have huge confidence in Dönitz, and it starts during this interwar training period. This high esprit de corps that we see within the German submarine service really does start here, and it's largely Dönitz's responsibility. Dönitz's training regimen and his legitimate care for his submariners builds this camaraderie within the service.
You'd almost have to be crazy to serve on these U-boats knowing how dangerous they are. But that's the kind of guy you want serving with you, like someone who's fully committed to making it work.
Yes. And so Dönitz, right? So in 1939, he advocates, he pushes for saying, he says, hey, I need 300 U-boats if we're going to beat the English, right? I need 100 at sea, 100 in repair, and 100 in training. Well, obviously Plan Z happens, and Dönitz does not get his 300 U-boats at the war. But despite not having the vessels that he wanted, Dönitz and his crew's professionalism brings them remarkable success in the first few months, or first few years of the war, really, starting with the sinking of the Athena on 3 September 1939.
Yeah.
That said, I don't think that you can say that Dönitz himself or even his submariners rather, are particularly deserving of all the credit for the successes that they have. The Allies really dropped the ball early on in the war. The number one problem that is plaguing the United Kingdom at the start is their lack of escort vessels. They just simply don't have enough escort vessels to protect all the convoys. So these wolf packs, they attack convoys that are just left wide open.
Yeah, when America was kind of in their neutrality stages, Churchill was like, well, just give me your old destroyers. I just need anything to escort these convoys. So just give me your destroyers from World War I and we'll take it.
And we'll talk about it later. But yeah, those World War I destroyers are more than adequate for the job. They convert fishing trawlers, or they try to convert fishing trawlers into escort vessels. They don't really work. They're not really suited for the Atlantic. But they end up building these really cheap corvettes that really aren't good for much other than hunting U-boats. That's all they needed to do. Now, when the United States enters the war against Germany on 11 December 1941, we also suffer horrific losses from the U-Boot-Waffe because of many of the same reasons, right? So we refuse initially to sail our ships in convoys. So we're just sending lone merchant ships along the American East Coast unprotected. They're sailing with their running lights on. So in the middle of the night, when a submarine's out actively looking for vessels, well, here's this brightly lit ship. And even worse, coastal cities like along the Carolina Capes, blackouts weren't enforced. So even if the ship didn't have its running lights turned on, if you're sailing past, we'll say Charleston, right? Charleston's brightly lit. That ship sails across it. Well, you can see the silhouette of the ship. And the German submarine service just cuts down Allied merchantmen off the Carolina Capes in the first half of 1942.
Under Dönitz's leadership, U-boats nearly severed Britain's Atlantic supply lines during the early years of the war. Could the U-boats have won the war against the Allies on their own?
No, I don't think that any one service in any war could win the war on their own. However, I will say that the German submarine service's failure to win the Battle of the Atlantic doomed Germany to defeat. Germany had to win the Battle of the Atlantic if it had any chance of pulling off a victory, but it wouldn't have guaranteed their victory on their own. Win the Battle of the Atlantic dooms Germany because, for obvious reasons, Germany is unable to bomb and attack American and Canadian industry, right? It's a whole ocean away. And as these supplies are flowing into the United Kingdom and later flowing into Europe themselves, attacking merchant vessels on the open seas represents kind of the only way, the only opportunity that German forces have to cut off enemy supplies and destroy their equipment before it made it onto the battlefield. Whereas the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force, right, they're able to bomb German equipment in the factories. They're able to bomb German industry before that equipment is even made, and they're able to bomb it when it's being transported.
It's kind of a follow-up question was, What might have happened in the naval war if Germany had focused entirely on submarines instead of building major surface ships like the Bismarck?
I think you'd see an absolutely insane level of response by the Allies. The Allies also recognized that the Battle of the Atlantic was the decisive theater of the European war, and they would have dedicated resources accordingly to build even more numbers of escort vessels, to pioneer new code-breaking technologies, to break the Enigma even faster, and they would have developed new novel anti-submarine warfare technologies.
Okay. In January 1943, Dönitz succeeded Erich Raeder as commander-in-chief of the German Navy. So what happened to Raeder?
So in early January 1943, Hitler summons Raeder to his headquarters, and he launches into a kind of a justifiable tirade against the German Navy. He flies off the handle and basically says that, with the exception of the U-boat force, the German Navy was not useful at all, and in fact represented a tremendous waste of millions and millions of marks to rebuild the German surface navy, and it was all flushed down the drain for nothing because they haven't actually achieved any success at all. He talked down on German naval history more broadly, basically saying that throughout Germany's entire existence, its navy was basically useless. And he threatened to scrap the entire German surface navy with the exception of like the E-boats and the S-boats and the U-boats, obviously. He was going to tear their guns off, use them for coastal defense, and all the crews were going to be reassigned to infantry units on the Eastern Front, right? Just one of these classic Hitler rants. Well, Raeder, he returns, he ruminates on this, right? This is obviously a strike to his ego. He was the champion of the German surface fleet in the interwar period. Well, on the 14th of January, Raeder meets with Hitler and he says, hey, I can't preside over you scrapping the surface fleet. And he asks to resign at the end of the month. Hitler obviously says, bye, see you. I'm kind of angry with you. And he's replaced with Dönitz, who seems like kind of the logical person to replace as the commander-in-chief of the Navy, especially after Hitler's tirade about how the only German naval component that has done anything of any value to him was the submarine service.
Yeah, I do want to talk here about Dönitz. Do you think he was primarily a professional naval officer, or was he fundamentally a committed Nazi?
Well, if you ask Dönitz, he was a naval officer, and he was not a dedicated Nazi at all. But we shouldn't take him for his word, right? After the war, Dönitz has a huge incentive to lie and distance himself from the Nazi regime. If we look at what Raeder says about Dönitz, Raeder claims that Dönitz was like this fanatical Nazi Hitler boy, I think is what he calls him. But we also shouldn't take Raeder's word for it, right? Raeder and Dönitz have this sort of rivalry. They kind of don't like each other. When we actually take a step back from what they say about each other, and we look at the evidence, it's kind of unclear. So before 1943, when Dönitz becomes the chief of the German Navy, he has really limited contact with Hitler. He's seen the guy a handful of times. Obviously, once he becomes the chief of the German Navy, he starts having a lot of extra contact with Hitler. Obviously so, right? He's the chief of the German Navy. He needs to be present for these meetings between, the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces and the other representatives of the other armed services. So he meets with Hitler about twice a month, and Hitler and Dönitz, they start to form and share kind of a mutual respect for one another, right? Hitler recognizes that Dönitz kind of knows what he's talking about, and he basically leaves a lot of naval strategy and doctrine kind of up to Dönitz. He doesn't really poke his fingers too much in there. And Dönitz, for his credit, he respects Hitler for that, right? He recognizes that Hitler has given him this sort of grace, rather, to run the Navy as he sees fit. This respect that Hitler has for Dönitz and vice versa only intensifies after the July 20 plot, when, lo and behold, it was only the Navy. The Navy is the only armed service that doesn't have any officers that are implicated in that. That kind of plays into what we'll talk about later when Hitler is choosing his successor. Dönitz seems kind of like the logical guy. But to say that he's not a Nazi is kind of not true, though, because he joins the Nazi Party in February 1944. If you join the Nazi Party, you would think that, hey, you're probably a Nazi. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that he was an anti-Semite, and he basically remained so until his death. His knowledge of the Holocaust is less clear. He, like most Germans, definitely knew that there was something happening. He may not have necessarily been privy to all the specifics or the scale of the atrocities that were happening, but he certainly knew that something was up. He knew
Yeah.
concentration camps existed. Maybe not death camps, but he certainly knew that concentration camps existed because he was using slave labor from these concentration camps in his shipyards. He specifically authorized the use of slave laborers in shipyards.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Hey guys, today I'm interviewing my cat about his perfect bistro food. Percy, you seem to be a big Perfect Bistro fan. Care to comment? Totally. What do you like about it? You love the high quality ingredients? And the delicious flavors, of course. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Listen to Percy, guys. Visit perfectbistro.com to try it for your cat.
Yeah, it's a little less clear with the German Navy because there's, as opposed to the German Army who had Einsatzgruppen following them everywhere in conquered territories, the Navy's a little different, but you're right. There's still slave labor being used in these shipyards. He knows what the Nazi ideology is. So yeah, you can't just give him a pass. And we'll get into the legacy with his memoirs.
Yeah, and it's important to point out that the German Navy is compared to most of the other armed services in Germany at this time, right? They have a relatively clean reputation. There's only a few stains on their record. We shouldn't take that to mean that the Navy was this like bulwark against Nazism within Germany. It's simply because the Navy just didn't have the opportunity to participate in war crimes. It's kind of hard to participate in, an Einsatzgruppen action when your primary role is out in the middle of the Atlantic.
Well, Allied code breaking, radar, air power, and improved anti-submarine tactics eventually turned the tide against the U-boat campaign in 1943. Did the Germans believe the Enigma code to be unbreakable, and what became of the U-boat fleet in the final stages of the war?
So the short answer to whether or not the Germans believed Enigma to be unbreakable or not is yes. There's a couple of reasons for this. The German intelligence services were divided up across the entirety of the German armed forces, right? There was a naval intelligence service, an army, the Abwehr, and some civilian organizations as well. Well, this really insulated them from one another and fostered a sort of rivalry between the intelligence services. So if there was a compromise in, let's say, the naval Enigma, that wasn't necessarily shared with the Abwehr. And so you start to cloud seeing the whole picture and you can't adjust accordingly. Germans were also very, very, very complacent with their use of the Enigma machines. For example, in January 1943, the German Navy had gotten suspicious that their codes may have been broken, and they devised this plan where they were going to see, is this so? They had ordered 2 U-boats out to circle in a certain quadrant, a way to apply submarine. But this supply ship was a little slow, and they ordered the submarines to go elsewhere. They wanted to pay attention to whether or not the British had actually intercepted this and would go to the original quadrant. Well, they had. The British showed up at that quadrant where there were no submarines, which seems logical to think that, hey, the British are listening to our transmissions. They knew that we were sending submarines to this quadrant. Thankfully, they didn't show up. However, the Kriegsmarine decided that, no, the British just got lucky. This is all a fluke. We're not actually going to fundamentally change the way that we transmit our radiograms. But they have this evidence right in front of them that the British are clearly able to read their communications.
And you think, the wolf packs aren't working anymore. They're sinking more U-boats than ever. They know when the wolf packs are going to strike before they strike. You think they would be like, all right, maybe something's going on here.
Well, the Germans are also really quick to blame this uptick in Allied successes on all sorts of other technologies, right? They're saying, oh, well, the enemy's radar must be really good, or their high-frequency direction finding is just getting off the charts, with pinpoint accuracy. Their ASDIC and sonar systems, that's why The Allies, to their credit, are also really good about covering their tracks. So whenever something like this happens, instead of saying, oh, we learned that your convoys were going to show up here because of our intercepts of your Enigma codes, they'll say, oh, no, we learned that from prisoner of war interrogation, or we learned it from some other way, just to put a cover on how they're actually learning about this stuff. And all of this combined leads the Germans, basically for the entire war, to think that Enigma hasn't been broken, when it clearly was, and all the signs were before them.
So do the U-boats then, towards the end of the war, just stay in port, or what's happening to them?
By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic is basically lost for the Germans. Dönitz continues to commit the submarines to sea regardless, right? He recognizes that he's lost, like on the strategic level, they've lost. There's nothing he can do to stop this flow of Allied supplies. However, he's a sailor, right? His duty is to continue to fight until he's told not to. So he continues to send these crews out to sea. If they can't win the war, at the very least, they can try to make life easier for the German infantry, right? They can sink supply ships, reinforcing the Allies in North Africa and the Mediterranean. He can sink supplies being sent to the Soviets through Murmansk. Obviously, right, this doesn't really do much. When the Allies invade France in 1944 through Operation Overlord and Dragoon, the French bases that they had taken after the fall of France, they're abandoned by the submarines. They actually stay in German hands until the end of the war because the Allies simply bypass them and decide it's not worth assaulting La Rochelle or Brest. But they're withdrawn to bases. The submarines are withdrawn to bases in Germany and Norway. At the end of the war in April 1945, Germany had about 470 or so total U-boats, only 170 of which were actually operational. As the Allies are closing in on Germany, all of the operational submarines, they're sent to Norway. When all those unserviceable ones in Germany, they start trying to scuttle them. Plans were actually put in place to try to scuttle all of the remaining U-boats in the event of German surrender. This plan was supposed to be enacted on them receiving the code word Regenbogen, Rainbow, right? Operation Rainbow. Well, on the 5th of May, 1945, Operation Regenbogen was authorized, right? The code word was sent out, but it was withdrawn less than 10 minutes later. The Western Allies were trying to negotiate with the Germans. They wanted the German Navy to surrender intact. However, after the order for Regenbogen was given, some of the ships had already been scuttled. You get some U-boat captains that just decide, hey, nope, my ship isn't going to be surrendered to the enemy, and they scuttle it anyways. At the same time that Operation Regenbogen is authorized, Dönitz orders all U-boats to cease hostilities immediately, right? Defensive actions only. You are not to attack anything. We're trying to play out what's going to actually happen. Let's not cause a major incident right here at the 11th hour. After Germany's surrender, the remaining U-boats, obviously, they also surrender. 52 of them surrendered at sea, and it's this kind of strange thing. Instead of a white flag of surrender, they're told to fly a black flag of surrender. I assume it's just easier to get black cloth in the confines of a submarine than it is to try to find something nice, white, and serviceable that can be seen. 98 surrendered in port. 2 submarines went to Portugal and scuttled themselves, and 2 fled to Argentina and fueled all sorts of rumors for the entire rest of humanity.
It's estimated 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in Germany's U-boat force died during the war, one of the highest casualty rates of any branch. So at what point do you think the Battle of the Atlantic became unwinnable for Germany?
So Dönitz himself in his memoirs, he says that it was basically lost in May 1943. And I tend to agree with him there. I have no reason to dispute. And there's several reasons for this. Number one, obviously, by May 1943, the Enigma code has well been broken. The Allies are clearly reading German naval traffic, and they're able to route convoys around where wolf packs are gathering. And they're also able to send hunter-killer groups to go and attack submarines where they are. This is also the tipping point where the Allies are able to build ships quicker than the Germans can sink them, and the Allies are also able to sink German submarines quicker than the shipyards can replace them. And then the final nail in the coffin in May 1943 is that that's when the Mid-Atlantic Gap gets closed. So this Mid-Atlantic Gap, it talks about this point of the Atlantic that is outside of Allied air cover from, airfields in Canada, airfields in the United Kingdom, airfields in Iceland. In May 1943, they introduced very modified, very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers that can basically fly out to the Mid-Atlantic Gap and back. And we start seeing increased number of escort carriers, aircraft carriers. So they're able to fly up, do survey, look around for enemy submarines, enemy reconnaissance aircraft, and deal with that problem.
I've never gotten to use these pictures behind me, and I think that they would apply. So this is the mid-Atlantic gap right here, where U-boats could operate without being attacked by aircraft, right?
Yes.
This is the coast of England and Ireland, where they could be attacked, and this is the coast of the United States, where they could be attacked, in Canada. But you're right. When they have planes that can go now into the middle, that gap is closed.
Yes. And by May 43, right, Dönitz himself, he admits this Battle of the Atlantic's over, and he withdraws his U-boats from the Atlantic for a brief period of time thereafter as he tries to figure out what next.
Well, here's a big what's next. In his final political will and testament, Adolf Hitler names Dönitz his successor after the Fuhrer's suicide on April 30th, 1945. So why do you think he chose Dönitz of all people? Was it his loyalty and abilities, or was it Hitler's distrust of the German army?
So before Hitler kills himself, he actually recognizes that it seems pretty likely, and in fact did happen, that Germany was going to be cut in half by the Allied approaches. So he would need to delegate army command to a northern command and a southern command. Well, command of all German forces in northern Germany, what remained of occupied Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, that fell on Dönitz's hand. He was the highest ranking military leader available in northern Germany. In the south, which is like northern Italy, Austria, parts of Bohemia, that falls on Field Marshal Kessler. So there's already this sort of precedence of Dönitz taking over everything. Well, he wasn't Hitler's first choice as an heir apparent, a successor. It was Goering, right? The entire war, Goering was Hitler's right-hand man. There's a problem, though. On the 23rd of April, Goering royally pissed off Hitler. He sends a telegram saying, hey, are you capable of leading the country right now? If I don't hear from you in the next few hours, I'm just going to assume that you're no longer able to take command. I'll be the Fuhrer. And Hitler flies off the handle. He calls Goering a traitor. He excommunicates him from the Nazi party, and he orders his arrest. And Goering is disgraced thereafter. So after Goering, it seems that Himmler's the logical successor, right? Problem is that Himmler had secretly been in contact with the Western Allies this whole time, trying to negotiate a surrender. And the British let this leak out, and Hitler, again, flies off the handle, calls Himmler a traitor, and orders his arrest for treason, which this doesn't actually happen. But with Himmler and Goering out of the picture, who do you have left? Hitler doesn't trust the army after the July 20 plot, so he's not going to pick an army leader to be in charge. He's kind of left with Dönitz. And so Dönitz and Goebbels were actually supposed to share power. Dönitz was supposed to be the head of state. Goebbels was going to be the head of the government. Well, Goebbels kills himself on May 1st. So Dönitz is kind of left as the supreme leader. Unexpectedly, he doesn't expect this, plops in his lap here at the 11th hour. And he goes, I guess I'm leading the show now.
Dönitz becomes Nazi Germany's last head of state and oversaw the final surrender of German forces in May 1945. What were his options in continuing the war?
Whenever Dönitz realizes, hey, I'm in charge of Germany now, I'm the leader of the German people, he establishes an HQ/seat of government at the Muvik Naval Academy, which it's pretty ironic that he begins and ends his military career at the Muvik Naval Academy in Flensburg. So Dönitz inherits a really, 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 really bad situation, and I don't think I can put enough reallys in front of that to explain. This is the 11th hour. Berlin has fallen. Germany barely controls any actual German territory. They hold slivers of the Netherlands, all of Denmark, most of Norway, some parts of Austria, Bavaria, a little bit of Italy, the Channel Islands. Basically, they're spread thin. There's nothing they can do. So Dönitz is under no illusion, right? He does not think that there's going to be some kind of magical turnaround and the war is going to be won. His entire government, this sort of period of time where he's the leader of Germany, is focused on how do we actually surrender? How do we surrender in the best way possible for Germany given the circumstances? His chief concern then was, number one, let's secure a good post-war future for Germany as best as we can. And number two, let's get as many Germans as absolutely possible away from the Soviets. Dönitz, like many other Germans, were absolutely terrified of falling into Soviet captivity, and for good reason. A lot of German prisoners of war that are forced into Soviet captivity after the war die there, and those that managed to survive aren't released until the mid to late 1950s. So Dönitz's whole goal is to protect Germans as best he can.
Yeah, he attempted to move as many German soldiers and civilians as westward as possible to surrender to British and American forces rather than the Soviets. So was he trying to shorten the war in May 1945, or was he delaying to mainly save German forces from Soviet captivity? What's he doing here?
So Dönitz was absolutely willing and did prolong the war to try to facilitate the evacuations. Since January 1945, like the chief task of the German Navy had been what's called Operation Hannibal, which is this naval evacuation of German military units and civilians from places like the Courland Pocket, from East Prussia, Pomerania, these sort of places, right? To get as many people out of the advance of the Soviet army as possible. By the end of Operation Hannibal in May 1945, nearly 1 million civilians had been evacuated and about 350,000 or so German soldiers. At the same time, Dönitz refused to allow military units that were facing the Soviets to surrender. He wanted them to continue to resist the Soviets harshly to try to buy as much time as possible to send as many civilians westward as possibly could happen. At the same time, he tries to negotiate, pretty famously, a separate surrender with the Western Allies. Eisenhower wasn't having it. Montgomery seemed like he might be able to play ball on that, but Eisenhower put his foot down and said, no, it's unconditional surrender or nothing. So what's Dönitz to do in this situation, right? The war goes on a few more days. He can get a couple more boatloads of civilians from the eastern provinces, but ultimately his hands kind of force him. He has to end the war on the 7th of May, 1945. He sends a representative to sign the surrender on 7 May 1945. They stage another one in Berlin on the 8th of May for the Soviets' credit, and the war's over for him. Interestingly, though, the Dönitz government continues to exist until the 23rd of May. They were very useful to the British, right? So Schleswig-Holstein and Flensburg, the seat of the government, was in the British zone of occupation. And the Dönitz government was a big benefit for the British, not only as sort of a bulwark against a potential Soviet sort of incursion into Denmark, but also as a way to facilitate an orderly demilitarization of German units there.
Yeah, at the Nuremberg trials, Dönitz was convicted of crimes against peace and violations of the laws of war and sentenced to 10 years in prison. So did accepting Hitler's succession make him morally responsible for the Nazi regime as a whole? I mean, I guess he could have turned it down.
So it's kind of hard to say that a guy who has been given the job for a week or so is somehow morally responsible for everything that was done before him. But ultimately, right, so the Dönitz government, it's dissolved on the 23rd of May. Dönitz and his government are arrested the same day, and they're later tried at Nuremberg. He's actually brought up on 3 of the 4 counts at Nuremberg, right? So he's brought up on, or he's indicted for the common plan or conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, right? Which is basically this idea that he was somehow instrumental in planning the outbreak of World War II. He's brought up on count 2, which is crimes against peace, right? Waging a war of aggression. And count 3, which is war crimes. It's very telling that he was not indicted on count 4 at the Nuremberg trials, which is crimes against humanity, which is sort of where most of the Holocaust-related crimes fall under. He's not even indicted for that. There's no evidence that he really participated in that. Well, on count 1, he's found not guilty, right? He was the submarine commander. He had there's no real evidence to suggest that he was sitting in cabinet meetings planning to start World War II. And that's sort of thrown away with pretty quickly in the trials. Count 2, and this is what gets him his 10-year sentence, is waging a war of aggression. As the officer commanding U-boats, later the chief of the German Navy, and later the chief of state, he is instrumental in waging this war of aggression, right? He commands German units in the field to fight. And then count 3, he's found guilty, but he doesn't receive any time for this. Count 3 is war crimes. And what they try to get him for, and they do this in several ways. First, they try to get him for waging unrestricted submarine warfare, right? Which is this idea that you can attack enemy merchant ships without warning. You can attack neutrals in certain areas. Well, what's end up saving Dönitz here is Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz testifies that, hey, the United States wages a unrestricted submarine war in the Pacific as well. And ultimately what ends up happening is the court decides, well, actually, unrestricted submarine warfare, it's not actually a war crime in that case, and he gets off on that. He's also sort of convicted for perpetuating the commando order of October 12, 1942. After the Dieppe raid, Hitler issues this order that all commandos are to be summarily shot. Basically, they argue that once Dönitz becomes the chief of the German Navy and later the head of state, he doesn't rescind this order, and so he's just as responsible as Hitler for issuing it. And then finally, they get him for authorizing the use of slave labor in German shipyards. But I do think it's telling if we go back to the point on how, ideologically fueled was Dönitz. Well, he receives the lightest sentence of any of the convicted at Nuremberg. He only gets 10 years, and he's only sentenced for basically waging the war.
Which is unusual because so many people went to the gallows, and he was the head of government at the end of the war, and he did not.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
Well, after his release in 1956, he remained largely unapologetic about his wartime service and dies in 1980. So let's discuss his legacy. Is he best viewed as a tragic military professional who was just doing his job, an effective strategist, or an enabler of one of history's most destructive regimes?
Well, I think like so many other things in history, the answer is somewhere in between, right? Clearly, he was an effective military strategist, right? Like he recognized that the German surface fleet had no chance of defeating the Royal Navy, and that if Germany had any chance of success on the high seas, it needed to go all in on the U-boat thing. He developed novel, effective U-boat tactics. He fostered an excellent esprit de corps in the German submarine service, and is, by all accounts, a fantastic military leader. But by being a fantastic military leader and serving a government which is perpetuating all sorts of crimes against humanity, he is by default an enabler of that. Now, whether you judge him as, he's somehow personally responsible for the atrocities that happened under the Nazi regime or not, that's a whole nother story. But you can't necessarily separate his military service from the government that he served, right?
Yeah, tricky legacy indeed. But
Yes.
Really good overview, Nathaniel. Thank you for that. Nathaniel Marshell, educating us on Admiral Dönitz, and really good stuff. I appreciate your time, sir. Of course, if you like our content, please like and subscribe wherever you hear podcasts. And if you want to support us, please go to patreon.com/Generals of World War II, and we'll see you soon.
I'm not giving up. I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
The right window treatments change everything. Your sleep, your privacy, the way every room looks and feels. At Blinds.com, we've spent 30 years making it surprisingly simple to get exactly what your home needs. We've covered over 25 million windows and have 50,000 five-star reviews to prove we deliver. Whether you DIY it or want a pro to handle everything from measure to install, we have you covered. Real design professionals, free samples, zero pressure. Right now, get up to 45% off site-wide, plus get a free professional measure at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions apply.
Evening. Buyer's remorse. Buy a new car? I'll be moving in. Let's get started.
Sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I bought it from Carvana.
You what?
Yeah, great price. I even have 7 days to love it or return it.
So there's no...
No buyer's remorse. More like buyer's rejoice.
I guess I'll let myself out. Congratulations. I mean it.
Buyer's rejoice. Buy your car today on Carvana.
Limitations and exclusions may apply. See our 7-day return policy at Carvana.com.